Welcome to today's presentation, An Introduction to Pooling and Unitization. My name is Alice Hogue, and I'll be your instructor. I'd like to begin with one of my signature Cajun jokes. Boudreaux had a sign out in his yard. It said, "Boat for sale." And Thibodeau came along. He said, "Boudreaux, man, I saw you saw that sign that said boat for sale. Man, you ain't got no boat." And so Boudreaux said, "Well, you see that motorcycle over there?" Thibodeau said, "Yeah." He said, "You see that trailer over there?" Thibodeau says, "Yeah." Boudreaux says, "They boat for sale." Okay, well, that's as close as I could get to a joke about pooling. It's about a boat. So I hope y'all enjoyed that. Today we are talking about pooling and unitization. This is a very important topic, and it is a lease provision, but I include it as a separate presentation because I want you to understand the impact of this one provision. So we'll begin with starting out with an explanation of there is a distinction between pooling and unitization. Now, sometimes when you apply to a regulatory commission, you end up with a pooled unit. That's what it's called. But that's different from this, which is field-wide unitization. So we're usually talking about a pooled unit when we're talking about this. Okay, so let's begin then with the agenda for today. I'd like to start off with an introduction to pooling, just some basic concepts, understand the history of it, understand how we got where we are today, and then talk about well spacing and the impact that that had. And then from well spacing, we're going to talk about the constitutional amendment that led to the creation of pooling. And then we'll talk about voluntary pooling, forced pooling, and then we'll end up with field-wide unitization. I want you to understand the difference between a pooled unit, a drilling unit, and field-wide unitization. So let's begin with a little bit of a history lesson. So as you all know, in 1859, Edwin L. Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Now, shortly after he struck oil, this is what the early oil fields looked like. Because people knew that there was money involved in it because of the kerosene lamps. And so there was literally derrick after derrick after derrick. Once there was one find, people just started putting up other wells in the area. Okay, this one isn't really too bad, but look at this one. Literally, they're so close together. Some of the reports that I've heard said that they even had their legs crossing over. The rig legs were crossing over. That's how close they were. Now, this is because of something called the rule of capture. The rule of capture, they had laws in place for minerals, hard minerals like gold or silver, okay? But gold and silver is different from oil and gas because gold is going to pretty much stay on your land. Silver is going to stay where you on your land, but oil and gas migrate. They move around. They're what we call fugacious. And so courts had to figure out, well, we can't apply the typical rules for hard minerals. So they came up with this rule of capture. So the rule of capture says that if you put a well in, everything that comes out of that well is yours, even if it's draining from your neighbor's pool, from your neighbor's oil share. So this is what the early oil fields looked like. This is between 1860 and 1930. Once again, you see the derrick after derrick after derrick, and so there's no spacing whatsoever. There's no limit. You could overproduce. There's lots of environmental waste. This is not water. This is oil. It's just sitting on the ground. There was a loss of pressure. If you think about a garden hose and if you puncture it with one hole and you turn on the garden hose or turn on the water full force, that one hole is going to spew out pretty high. But if you put a bunch of holes in that garden hose and then you turn on the water, each is just going to have a little trickle coming out of it. A little bitty kind of a bubbling thing coming out of it. So then they realized that, or what happened was there were so many holes in the ground with all these different wells that one report said that they left 75 to 80% of reserves in the ground. So this was a very inefficient way to do it. The other problem was an out of control market. What happens when you have an overproduction? Well, you know the laws of supply and demand. We're kind of looking at that today. When there's an overproduction, the laws of supply and demand says that the oil prices will fall. And that's what happened during this time period. Oil prices began to fall. This is just another image for you. This is Spindletop, October 6, 1902. Remember, that was the one in Beaumont, Texas. I mean, look at how many wells are on this field. I mean, if it were a forest, it would be a really dense forest. That's a lot of trees. So that was the negative history that we had with respect to the oil and gas industry, is that once oil was discovered, because of the rule of capture, people would put their hole in the ground so they could get their fair share. Otherwise, they would be drained by their neighbor. So this is the way it was between 1860 and 1930 until a man named George Strake came along. George Strake, not George Strait, not the country western singer, but George Strake. Now, for those of you that are from Houston, George Strake is a very well-known name here. He built a high school that's called Strake Jesuit High School, and he also has a Boy Scout camp that's located just outside of Houston. It's called Camp Strake. So he was a very generous benefactor, but he had the ridiculous notion that there was oil in Conroe, Texas, and everyone thought he was crazy. Really, there had not been a big producer since Spindletop. So here he was in the 1930s, and he decides that there's oil and gas under this ground. Now, for the first time in history, he was able to lock up 8,500, a block of 8,500 acres. So if you have a lease that's 8,500 acres, doesn't matter if it's 10 acres, 20 acres, 160 acres, all you need is one well to hold that entire lease. And so on August 31st, what do I have here? August 31st, 1931, George Strake drilled this well. And the well was the biggest producer since Spindletop. And it really set the Gulf Coast again as a major oil producing area. So what he did was, this well was so significant because he only had one well in the ground. Now, states had kind of already been talking about this. They had, these national organizations put together that were trying to come up with a system of, figuring out how to space the wells out. But really, not until Conroe Field this should be 1931, sorry. Not until the Conroe Field did they realize the huge impact that one well on a lot of properties would make. And so that's why, from that point on, states began to have state spacing laws, saying you can only have one well for so many feet distance from another well. Now, this is George Strait. Just thought that was interesting. This is the Conroe Field. He became very, very wealthy. All right, so here's what we have as spacing wells today. This is what we see now if we're walking down or driving down the highway and we see wells there. See how they're evenly spaced out. So the advantages of that obviously are there's much less environmental waste. There's much less of a footprint. But the other thing is it limited the number of wells that could be drilled. Now, spacing then were these laws that designated the distances and areas between wells to most efficiently recover oil and gas. So let's look at the two different types of well spacing. One is called lineal, and lineal establishes the distance between a well and other points, like another property line or another lease line or unit line. Density says how much acreage is required for a single well. Now in Texas, these fall under what we call Rule 37. It's part of the Texas statutes. And what it says basically is that no well can be drilled. Here's the lineal side of it. No well can be drilled closer than 467 feet from a property line, a lease line, or a unit line, and 1,200 feet from another well. So that's the spacing. That's how, you can't have a well closer to the property line than 467 feet. The other one to 1,200 feet. So the next one is the density spacing. And what that said is that you can only have one well per 40 contiguous acres. So the issue is if you can only have one well for 40 acres and you have a bunch of owners, where are you going to put that well? So let's say, for example, this equaled 40 acres. Little bitty tracts of land. The state is saying if you want a drilling permit, you have to show me that you have 40 acres because you can only have one well for 40 acres. So what they're going to have to do is here's all these different owners, different leases. So where are we going to put this well? Well, usually where we put the well is in the middle of the section. So right here. Okay, so lucky number 22 is the only person in here. This is before pooling. The only person in here who's going to be entitled to royalty payments. So the rest of these royalty owners said, wait a minute. This isn't fair. You are depriving us of our right to have a well on our own property by these well spacing laws. And so they filed a lawsuit that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they argued that under the 14th Amendment of the United States, that was an undue taking of property without due process of law. So the 14th Amendment says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So the court is saying state spacing, if it's only going to allow one person to recover royalty and no one else gets to even have a well on their land, that is a taking of property. That is a taking of their mineral interest without due process of law. So oil and gas companies, y'all need to come up with some way so that these people still have a right to any oil that's drained from their property. And so that's when pooling was invented. Now, pooling is when you combine 40 acres, combining small or irregular tracts into a unit big enough to meet the state spacing regulations of one well per 40 acres. Now, the well location, the beauty of pooling is that the well location may still be in the middle of that section, but instead of just 22 benefiting, all the other royalty owners will benefit as well because they're going to get paid. All these other small tract owners are going to get paid even if the well is not on their property. So this was the advantage. Now, what you got to realize, though, is they're not going to be paid their full, let's say if this number 9 guy had a 3/16 royalty interest. He's not going to get paid 3/16 of the production if he were the only owner. He's going to get a percentage of this 3/16. And the percentage is going to be calculated by saying the net acres that he contributes to this well. Let's say this is 5 acres. So we're going to multiply the royalty times 5 acres divided by the total unit acres, which is 40. And that's how you get those really long 8 decimal place interest. So if we do it for this one, we know that a 3/16 is a 0.1875. And we're going to multiply that, reduce that by the amount that he's actually contributing. And I'm just going to plug in 5 divided by 40. And that's going to give me a 0.125. So 0.1875 times 0.125 equals a 0.023 34375. So this is what he's getting, really 2% rather than 18%. But he's at least getting something. Before pooling, he would have been out of luck. So he's at least getting a part of it. Now, the other thing that happens is, I think I told you that I negotiated my brother's oil and gas lease. He has property in the Haynesville in Louisiana. And he did not want to see that well in his backyard. So we put a surface use restriction on it. So now he gets a share of the well, but he doesn't have to look at that oil well in his backyard. In fact, he cannot even see the well from where he is. That's the other advantage of pooling. Now, the other advantage of pooling from the lessee's perspective, is that we only have to put one well. We don't have to, under the rule of capture, have a well in every single one of these leases. And as you know, a well can cost $6 million and up. So it's a huge benefit to the lessee. It is a huge benefit to the lessor. So let's look at what these benefits are. First of all, it's economic and efficient. As we said, the oil and gas company doesn't have to put $6 million into the ground. He's only got to put one. Everyone's going to get paid a royalty payment, regardless of where that well is located. A lot of times in leases, they'll have a provision that says you're required to drill an offset well if a well is drilled within so many feet of this well. That's no longer an issue because pooling wipes away the offset requirement. There's no delay rentals due because the pooling, that one well is going to hold the entire lease. And it's fair and equitable to everyone. So the heart of pooling is that each lease is maintained for the life of the production from the pooled unit after the primary term. And then production and revenue is allocated and shared by various pooled units, pooled interest on a surface acre basis. So that's where we're talking about. He's only got 5 net acres, and we're going to divide that by the total unit acres. Okay, now when I say net acres, what I mean is someone could own 160 acres. That would be their gross acres. Oops, oh shoot, sorry. Let's start over. Someone could own 160 acres, okay? That's what it's going to say on their mineral deed. But when you run the chain of title, you realize that they only own 50% mineral interest in that. So their gross acres is going to be 160 acres, and their net acres is going to be 80 acres. Okay, so that is this allocation. So we're doing the royalty interest times the mineral interest, that's 50%, times the net acres divided by the unit acres. And that's what that formula is. So that's how it's allocated based on surface acre basis. They have 5 acres here, or they have 80 acres if we're going to use this one. So that is the heart of pooling. Once you understand this part of it, you really understand pooling. You understand the impact of it. So now I want to show you, I want to go through some case law with you to show you how this works. There are certain requirements for valid pooling. And these requirements are, it's got to be in good faith. There has to be 2 or more good leases. And the pooled unit has to spell out the correct substance. So let's begin with good faith. Amoco had this lease. This is Amoco versus Underwood, which was a, forget, let me see what year that was. These are all really old cases. A 1977 case. So what happened was Underwood was going to drill on this acreage, okay? But they realized that they had this other lease right next to this 643 acres that was about to expire. And so what they did was they tried to carve in a little bit of that 2,252 acre lease here, because they knew in a pooled unit, every lease would be held. And so if they put a well here, that would maintain their acreage not only as to the 643, but as to the 2,252 acres. Why? Because a portion of that, this is one lease, a portion of that one lease is included in the pooled unit. And the court said, no, that's bad faith. You can't just arbitrarily include someone else's acreage so that you can save another lease. 643 acres is plenty of tracts to combine for pooling. You don't need to combine these other 2,252. Now, this is a good example of the Pugh Clause. Pugh Clause is an amendment to the oil and gas lease invented by a man named Lawrence Pugh, who was a Louisiana attorney. Now, the problem here is, if this was included, all right, we did include this little piece, it would hold this whole 2,252 acre. This well over here would hold this entire 2,252 acres, even though outside of this, the royalty owners would not get paid anything. This does not go into their calculation. All that goes into the calculation is the acreage that's in the unit. So Lawrence Pugh came along and he said, that's not fair. It's really not fair, because here they're not getting paid on the 2,252 acres, and they can't lease it to someone else because it's leased under this pooling unit. So he came along with the Pugh Clause that says it's part of the lease is within a pooled unit, like here is within a pooled unit. Ignore this line. And part is out. This part is out. You have to release the part that's outside of the pooled unit. So in other words, if they have a Pugh Clause in that oil and gas lease, then all of this extra acreage can be released. And then the landowner can then lease it to someone else, get another bonus payment for it, and maybe even have a productive well where they'll get a royalty payment on it. Okay, so that's good faith. It also gives me an opportunity to talk about the Pugh Clause. Two or more good leases. So in this case, lease A had a pooling clause, and lease B did not have a pooling clause. Okay, they formed a pooled unit, and they drilled a well on B. Does the well on B hold the lease acreage on A? Now, in a typical unit, if these facts were, this is two leases that are combined together. If they're in a pooled unit, we drill on this one, it's going to hold the other one. But in this case, the court said it wasn't a good lease because B's lease did not have a pooling clause on it. So it has to be two or more good leases, meaning leases with a pooling clause. So this well on B's property is not going to hold the interest of A because B didn't have a pooling clause in his lease. Everybody with me? Okay. And the last one is pooled substances. So if you apply for a pooling unit, an oil pooled unit, and you come up with gas, then nothing is pooled because it's got to be for the specific substance that you applied for with the state regulatory agency. Okay, so Sunak pooled for gas, but they discovered oil. And so the court held that the non-drill site lease was beyond the primary term, and non-drill site lease is no longer held because there was no well there that was producing oil, that was producing gas. So that's the other one. Whatever you put in your pooling unit application, then for what substance, if you don't produce that substance, the pooling unit does not apply. Okay, So let's then look at voluntary units. So now we've covered the history, we've talked about how we got to spacing, and we just introduced pooling as a solution to the problem of the taking of property without due process of law. So now let's talk about pooling. Now there's two ways to pool. One is voluntary pooling and the other is forced pooling or compulsory pooling or statutory. But let's look at voluntary pooling first. The most common way to voluntarily pool the acreage is to have a pooling provision in the oil and gas lease. Now, some very sophisticated landowners will say, well, I'm not going to give you permission to pool my land. I want you to come to me and ask for my permission. Laura, this is kind of like that lease we were looking at. And then we'll give you an amendment to that lease. Okay, so they're going to decide on a case-by-case basis whether or not they want to add that amendment to the lease. And the other type is what's called a community lease. If you have someone that owns property, tract 1 and tract 2, let's say this one is in section 10, the north half, and this is section 10, the south half. If we drill a well on 10, that's going to hold this acreage, even though the pooled unit was this way. Because if there is in one lease different property descriptions, a well on either of those is going to hold the whole lease. That's known as a community lease. And that's why in a lot of the advice they give landowners, they tell them you want a separate lease for every legal description. So if this was all just section 10, that would be one thing. But let's say, probably a better example is if this was section 12, okay, and you drilled on section 10. That's going to hold the lease on section 12 because it's all on the same lease. So that's called a community lease. Landowners want to avoid that. Oil and gas companies like that. So that's the voluntary end of it. Now, the most common, of course, is the pooling provision. And so the pooling provision, if I'll just read it to you here, it says that lessee, at its option, is hereby given the right and the power to pool, unitize, or combine the acreage covered by this lease or any portion thereof as to oil and gas or either of them with any other lands covered by this lease and or with any other land, lease, or leases in the immediate vicinity, hereinafter stipulated. So that spacing requirement is 40 acres, but it's 40 contiguous acres. They've got to be all next to each other. So this is a typical pooling clause. This is called voluntary pooling because the landowner is saying, you have my permission to pool my interest. So that's voluntary. Okay, so now let's look at forced pooling. This is involuntary. 39 of 50 states have what we call forced pooling statutes. Now, Texas has one, but it's very rarely been applied. And the way forced pooling works is that at the lessee's option, that is at the oil and gas company's option, if he has owners of separate tracts that do not agree to pool, let's say there's no pooling provision in their lease, or maybe they have an owner that is unlocatable. They ran the chain of title, they found the owner, but no one knows where that owner is. Another example of when forced pooling occurs is when you have a mineral owner who refuses to lease his land. So that's known as an unleased mineral owner. Now, a lot of times, if you have an owner that will not sign an oil and gas lease, let's say this guy right here says he's not going to sign. What a lot of companies will do is they will just exclude that from the pooled unit. And now this guy's not getting anything. But if you desperately needed that property, you would include it in that pooled unit. And so now the question becomes, what do you do? You've got them in the pooled unit. Do you have a right to force them into this unit against their will? Now, I'm setting you up because the issue is whether the government has the right to force someone into being pooled if they don't give their consent. And I know that's why I'm setting you up. It sounds like, oh no, we would never want the government to do that. But look at this example. And I think I have a video of y'all. This guy explains it really well. But if you have a drilling unit on somebody's property, that drilling unit is going to drain the property of everyone else. And so if only this person gets leased, all the oil and gas from this unleased owner's land, this unleased owner's land, or maybe an unlocatable owner's land is going to all flow to this one person. Now, why does the state care? The state cares because they want people to be independent. And you're basically, by their own ignorance, depriving themselves of a stream of income, that money for nothing that goes to royalty owners, or in this case, they might even be working interest owners. You're depriving them of that. And so the risk is that they're not going to be able to provide for their family, and therefore they're going to end up on the state welfare rolls. So that's why the government has an interest in this. They don't think it's fair that one person should benefit because these guys didn't want to lease or were unlocatable. So this is what happens without compulsory pooling. This is what happens with compulsory pooling. So with compulsory pooling, these non-consenting landowners or these unleased landowners or these unlocatable landowners are forced into the unit, the pooled unit, but they get money. You know, here they're getting nothing, right? But here they are getting money. And so they will be able to provide for their families and not rely on the government dole, as they say in England. Okay, so let's look at the process then to force pool someone, and then I'll tell you the options of the person that's force pooled. The first thing that happens is that the operator applies to the regulatory agency for a forced pooling order. Now, in Texas, this would be the Texas Railroad Commission. In Louisiana is the Louisiana Department of Conservation. Different states have different agencies that handle this, but you would apply to whatever that agency is for a forced pooling order. Now, that regulatory agent will issue a spacing order for the depth and formation expected to be production. That's what pools the royalty owner. And then the regulatory agents will also issue a spacing order to force pool the working interest owners. Now, this may also include what we call the non-participating royalty owners. So it's working owners and these non-participating royalty interest owners. For those of you that don't know what a non-participating royalty interest owner, it's, let's say someone owns a 100% mineral ownership in a property. Okay, and someone wants to buy this property from him. So he sells his 100% mineral interest to party B, but he reserves a royalty interest. And what he's saying is, if an oil and gas company ever comes along and leases from you, I'm going to get a share of that royalty. Whatever royalty fraction they put in there for you, I'm going to get a share of it. So, for example, if the lease was a 1/4 lease, then this guy would get a 1/8 share of that. This guy then becomes known as this non-participating royalty interest owner. Non-participating because he no longer has the right to consent to a lease. When you convey your mineral interest, B then has what we call executory power. That means he has the right to execute a lease. The non-participating royalty interest does not have the right to execute a lease. He's not entitled to bonus. He's not entitled to delay rentals. The only thing he's entitled to is if there's production, he's going to get a fraction of whatever the fraction was in the oil and gas lease. So that's another situation where forced pooling would occur. So then let's look at the options for these owners. So let's say you have an owner that is unleased, okay? Someone that just says, no, I don't want to, lease this property at all. That is known as the unleased mineral owner. And if he doesn't lease, he's not a royalty interest owner. He becomes a working interest owner. Okay. Now, the options that he has is, as a working interest owner, he can either pay for his fair share of the well, of the cost of the well. So if it's a $6 million well and there's other people in there, he's going to have to pay for his fair share of the well. Now, a lot of times these people aren't going to have the financial resources to do that. So the other option that they have is they can choose option 2. And by the way, these are all spelled out in a statute. That's why it's called statutory pooling or compulsory pooling. The other one is that they can pay a penalty. Now, what that means is that they don't have to participate in the well. In other words, they don't have to sink money into the well. The risk here is if they hit a dry hole, this guy's out his money. But here, in this case, if they drill a dry hole, this guy isn't out his money. But if there's production, he's not going to get a share of that production right away. He's going to not receive any profit until all the cost of drilling the well have been recouped. So that is the penalty. Now, this may sound like the optimum choice because there's no risk of a dry hole, but you're still getting a share without really having to put any money into it. But this well may never pay out. It may never recoup 300%. In other words, it goes into debt for $6 million, and then it produces $6 million. That's 100%. Then it's got to produce another $6 million. That's 200%. And then it's got to produce another $6 million. That's a 300% penalty. So he has to wait till that well has produced $18 million before they get a share of that well. And it may never happen. So they may be on the verge of reaching that 300% threshold, and someone says, hey, let's do a rework of this. So now they not only have to pay for the rework, but they have to pay for the rework to pay itself out 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. So the risk here is that you may never get anything. The other option is that the lease states the set bonus and royalty. So the lease, in the statute, it'll say, we're going to presume that you are electing to lease with us. Therefore, you're entitled to this bonus of $300 an acre and a 1/8 royalty. This could also say, the market value in the area. But ultimately, if this owner, whether it's an unleased mineral owner or a non-participating royalty owner or a unlocatable owner, if they refuse to lease and they refuse to make an election here, they are going to be deemed to have leased. Now, in this case, they don't have any of the risk of being a working interest owner, and they don't have to wait till the well pays out 3 times before they get anything. But they're also not going to make as much money as a working interest owner would make. So failure to elect, the state deems number 3 has been elected. Okay, so here's what's another important thing to keep in mind. If there's 4 owners or there's 3 owners, okay, that share an interest in this property, and they're going to drill a well, and there's an unleased mineral owner, he can come in as the 4th working interest owner. And if that well is successful, he's not going to get a royalty fraction, this royalty fraction here, times his net acres over his gross acres. Remember that example? We said it was 3/16 times the 5 over 40, for example. And that was a 0.0202. No, what he's going to get if this well is successful is he's going to get 25% of the well. Remember, 3/16 is 18%. And that's a pretty good lease. So 25% working interest is way more money that they're ever going to make as a lessor by choosing this option. But it's also way more risk, right? Either because you have to sink your money into this trusting the oil and gas companies that it's not going to be a dry hole, or you may never get a share of it because of this penalty, or you could get a guaranteed payment if there's production, but it's never going to amount to what you could make as a working interest owner. So those are the options for forced pooled working interest owners. And, just remember that if they choose nothing, they're presumed to have elected number 3. Okay, so now we've covered spacing, we've covered pooling, voluntary pooling, and forced pooling. Now I want to turn and look at field-wide unitization. What field-wide unitization is when they have a bunch of pooled units. So let's say they have 40 acres here and here's a well, and 40 acres here and here's a well, and 40 acres here and here's a well. So everything's nice and spaced out. And what they want is to put more wells in here. And the reason they want to put more wells in here is because they believe there is a reservoir under all of these acres. And so they are going to seek from the state regulatory agency permission to combine all these pooled units into one, what they call a field-wide unit. Now, this can be either voluntary or compulsory, depending on the rules of the state. So let's look at the voluntary side of it. That is, the working interest owners would execute a unit agreement. That means everybody's in agreement. Everybody says, yeah, we think that there's a reservoir under here. Let's combine all this into one field-wide unit, and then that way we can get permission to put more wells in to help get the oil flowing. So they have to have a geographical description of the field and the formation to be unitized. This is going to be spelled out in the unit agreement. They also have to spell out in the unit agreement the method of injection and the substances to be injected. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then also in that agreement will be the tract participation factors allocated to each separate tract. Now, some people refer to, remember where you had the net acres over the gross acres? 5 over the 40. Some people refer to this as a tract participating factor. What is the net acres over the gross acres? So I'm going to show you another kind today, but I just want you to be aware that someone will say, well, what's the tract participation factor? And all they're asking you is what's the net over the gross? What's that decimal interest? All right, so that is field-wide unitization. Compulsory, it depends on the rules of the state. That is, if all the working interest owners do not agree, different states have different parameters. For example, in North Dakota, 62.5% of the working interest owners have to agree to before they will form a field-wide unit. In Mississippi, it's 80%. Okay, so there is a voluntary aspect to this, and there is a compulsory aspect to this. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to add more injection wells. So you can only have one well. Well, we're going to seek permission to get more wells in there. And the reason that you have these wells is because it's at the end of the life of the field, and we know that because we're using a horsehead pump, or a pump jack as it's sometimes called. And you remember when you first put a well in there, you just put that cute little Christmas tree, and all, because of the pressure from the earth, all the oil and gas would naturally flow up. Well, at the end of the life of the field, we're going to put one of these horsehead pump jacks, and it's got like a kind of like a syringe effect. It will go in here, suck up the oil, and then put it into the pipeline or the storage tank or whatever it is. So go down here, suck it up, store it out. Okay. So at this point, this oil in the ground is getting pretty gunky. It's pretty thick. And so, that's why it's not flowing up really easily. So if we do field-wide unitization, we can put what's called an injection well. This is called an injection well. And we can inject that with either air or water or different kinds of things. But typically for a secondary recovery unit, it's going to be air and water. Now, this is also known as enhanced recovery operations. You can either call it that, or you can call it secondary or tertiary. So secondary, meaning the second time we go in, first time being the initial well, the second time we go in is to inject air and water. And if that doesn't work, then our next thing we can do is we can have tertiary recovery. Just think of this as the secondary. This is tertiary. Okay. And in a tertiary recovery, they're going to inject water and carbon dioxide. So they're getting permission to put in this injection well. And what they're going to inject is water, carbon dioxide, or natural gas. Somebody told me they can even have fire in there. They can inject fire in there. And what they're doing is they're just trying to get that gunky oil to flow back up to this horsehead well. So that, in a nutshell, is field-wide unitization. I go over that because I want you to be aware of the distinction between a pooled unit, a drilling unit, and field-wide unitization. So let's look at what we talked about today. We began with an introduction to pooling, and we talked about kind of the history of early oil and gas discoveries and the literal derrick after derrick after derrick of well. Oh, and I forgot to tell you, they have all these derricks. Sometimes you'll see an application for an increased density well. I never really knew what that was. But what it is it's asking for permission to put more trees in the forest, if you will, more rigs in the forest. So it's increasing the density by putting wells closer together. And so that's what was happening in the early oil fields. You literally saw derrick after derrick after derrick. There was a lot of issues with it. The main one being that 70 to 80% of reserves were being left in the ground. So it was a very inefficient method. Now, there were states were talking about having well spacing to address this issue, but not until George Strait came along in Conroe, Texas in 1931, where he had an 8,500 acre lease block, and he could put one well on there, and that one well produced as much as Spindletop. So it was a huge producer, and that's what really pushed states to say, let's put these statutes in our laws, because we want to have this well spacing because we're going to get more out of it. It's going to be more environmentally friendly. It's just better all around. It's cheaper for the oil and gas companies because they only have to put one well per 40 acres. But what happened was if they said you have to have 40 acres and you have people that owned a bunch of little bitty acres, where's that well going to go? It's going to go in this person's property, and they alone are going to be entitled to the royalty. And so the other royalty owner said that's not fair. They filed a lawsuit, breach of 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, taking a property without due process of law, and that's when pooling was born. So pooling, no matter where you put this, everyone's going to get a share of the oil that's produced or the gas that's produced. Now, there's voluntary. The most common type that we see is in a lease clause, and we showed you that lease clause. There's also something called a community lease, and then there's an amendment to the lease. And then we talked about forced pooling. If you had someone that is unlocatable or refuses to lease or is a non-participating royalty interest owner. In that case, you could force those people into the unit by what's called compulsory pooling, forced pooling, or statutory pooling. And we walked you through the benefits of each. And then we told you what the choices were that they had. The one choice to pay their fair share, the second choice to pay a penalty, and the third choice to lease. And then that allowed us to go into a discussion of field-wide unitization. So you could distinguish a drilling unit from a pooling unit from field-wide unitization. So I hope this was helpful for you. I hope you learned something. Is this, I just got a great thing from one of our students. Holy cow, now I know what I have been doing. I love it when the light goes on. Okay, so any questions about this? Okay, well, if there's no questions, I thank you for attending this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.